There's something strange about cats. You probably already know this somewhere in the back of your mind, even if you've never quite put it into words. You can sit with a cat for an hour, watch it sleep in a patch of sunlight, feel it settle its weight against your leg, and still have absolutely no idea what it's thinking. Dogs you can read. Dogs are loud about what they want and how they feel, but cats sit at the edge of things, watching you with those half-closed eyes, and you get the feeling that the balance of familiarity and mystery has never quite tipped in your direction. They're here. They're warm. They chose to be in this room with you tonight, and yet somehow, after 10,000 years of living alongside human beings, they remain genuinely unknowable. That tension, that feeling of a creature that is close, but never completely yours, is what this whole story's about. If you're listening to this to fall asleep, that's exactly why it exists. So settle in, pull the covers up, let your breathing slow down. This is going to be a long, slow journey through 10,000 years of history, and you don't need to hold on to any of it tightly. Just let it drift past you like smoke. And if you're awake enough to do one thing before you drift off, drop a comment and tell me where you are right now and what time it is there. I read every single one. It's one of my favourite things about this, watching the timestamps stack up. Someone in Melbourne finishing their morning coffee. Someone in London lying in the dark at 2 a.m. Someone in Sao Paulo with the window open and the city still going outside. All of you together, listening to the same quiet story about cats. Now, here is the mystery at the centre of everything. Most animals that human beings domesticated, they were broken. That sounds harsh, but it's accurate. We selected them, generation after generation, for traits that made them easier to control. Compliance, dependence, a tendency to look to humans for direction. Dogs lost the capacity to survive well without us. Cows, sheep, horses, pigs, they were reshaped so fundamentally over thousands of years that many of them couldn't exist in the wild anymore. Not really, not comfortably. We took wild things and we made them need us. Cats did not allow this. Somewhere around 10,000 years ago, in the arc of land stretching from modern-day Turkey down through the Levant and into Egypt, human beings were doing something they had never done before on any real scale. They were settling down, building villages, storing grain, creating the conditions completely by accident for one of the most quietly consequential relationships in the history of our species. And cats walked in from the edges of the wild and decided on their own terms that this arrangement was acceptable. Not because we captured them, not because we bred them for it, because the math worked out in their favour. Rodents near the grain, birds near the rodents, shelter, warmth. Humans who were, it turned out, easy enough to manage. What followed was 10,000 years of something that doesn't quite fit any category we have for it. It wasn't domestication the way we usually mean the word. It was more like a negotiation that never fully concluded. And the evidence for that is sitting in your house right now, if you have a cat, looking at you with those eyes that were designed by millions of years of evolution to see in the dark, to track movement you can't perceive, to watch things you'll never notice. Your cat is still, in most of the ways that matter genetically, a wild animal. Just one that decided you were worth tolerating. That's the mystery. And the history of how we got from those first settlements to the cat asleep at the foot of your bed tonight is longer and stranger and more surprising than most people realize. We're going to travel across that whole span of time together. We'll start in the ancient Near East, in the early farming villages where the first quiet alliance between humans and small wild felines probably began, not with intention, not with a plan, but with an accident of proximity that turned into something neither side fully initiated. We'll move into Egypt, where cats were elevated into something extraordinary, revered, protected by law, associated with gods, and the management of forces that people then believed could tip the whole world sideways. We'll follow them out of Egypt along the trade routes, across the Mediterranean, onto ships where sailors carried them not for companionship but for survival. Because a ship full of grain with no cat is a ship that loses its cargo to rats before it makes port. We'll trace the paths cats walked across land and sea, through Roman towns and monastery gardens and medieval ports, into folklore and superstition, into centuries where the same animal that had been sacred in one culture became feared and persecuted in another. We'll sit with the darkness of the early modern period, when cats were caught in the violence of witch trials and mass fear, when the black cat became a symbol of something people were desperate to name and destroy. And we'll come out the other side into the Victorian era, where everything changed again, where cat shows and breeding programs and the modern idea of a pet began to take shape in a form we'd actually recognize today. And then we'll go all the way down into the genetics, into what the DNA of cats actually tells us about how this relationship unfolded, what domestication looks like at a molecular level, and why, after all of it, after all those thousands of years, cats never became dogs, never lost the thing inside them that keeps them at the edge of the fire rather than in the middle of it. That question, why didn't they just become ours, is the one that runs underneath all of it. And the answer is one of the most quietly fascinating things in all of natural history. So, wherever you are right now, whatever time it says on the clock beside you, this is where we start. It's 10,000 years ago, roughly. The world is colder than it will become. The first farmers are keeping their first granaries. And somewhere out in the dark, just past the reach of the firelight, something is watching. Before we get to the granaries and the first farms, we need to go back a little further. Back into the world that existed before any of that. The world that shaped the cats who would eventually make that choice to come closer. The felid family is old. Genuinely, geologically old. Cats as a distinct lineage have been around for somewhere in the range of 10 to 11 million years, branching off from a common ancestor and slowly diverging into the dozens of species we recognize today. Lions, leopards, cheetahs, tigers. The great hunters that have threaded through human mythology on every continent where humans and big cats have shared territory. But also, quieter and less celebrated, the small cats. The ones that don't make it into legends quite as often. The ones that hunt mice instead of antelope. Felis silvestris, the wild cat, spread across Europe, Africa and the Near East in several related subspecies, and looking, if you're honest about it, remarkably like the cat asleep somewhere in your house tonight. That resemblance is not a coincidence. It's the whole story. The wild cat is not a dangerous animal in the way that big cats are dangerous. It's about the size of a large domestic cat, maybe slightly heavier, built for ambush hunting in scrub and grassland and forest edge. It eats small rodents, birds, lizards, insects. It's territorial and largely solitary. It does not, under normal circumstances, seek out the company of other species, and yet it is precisely this animal, specifically the subspecies Felis silvestris libica, the African wildcat, that genetic evidence now points to as the ancestor of every domestic cat alive today, every one of them. The cat on your bed, the street cats in Istanbul, the pampered show cats at exhibitions in London, all of them trace their lineage back to this small, secretive, rodent-hunting creature from the Near East and North Africa. But before that convergence could happen, the world had to arrange itself in a particular way, and that required some help from the climate. The Ice Age was not a single event. It was a long, complicated, stuttering series of advances and retreats, cold pulses and warmer intervals stretching across tens of thousands of years. During the colder, drier periods, vast regions that are temperate today were locked under steppe, or ice or desert. Animal populations contracted and shifted. Prey species followed the vegetation, predators followed the prey, and human populations, still mostly mobile, still following herds and seasons, moved with all of it. Then, roughly 12,000 years ago, the climate began its most recent significant warming. The glaciers pulled back, rainfall patterns shifted. The Fertile Crescent, that arc of land running through what is now Turkey, Syria, Lebanon, Israel, and down into northern Egypt, became something remarkable, productive, reliable, full of wild grasses whose seeds could be gathered, stored, and eventually planted deliberately. The stage was being set for agriculture, and agriculture, as it turned out, was going to be extremely good for wildcats, but not for the reasons anyone planned. This is the moment to think carefully about what we mean when we use the word domestication, because it gets used loosely and it covers a lot of very different things. True domestication, in the biological sense, means selective breeding over multiple generations for traits that make an animal more useful or more manageable. It's intentional. It reshapes the animal at a genetic level. It produces creatures that are genuinely different from their wild ancestors, in behavior, physiology, often appearance. Dogs went through this process. So did cattle. So did horses and pigs and sheep. Taming is something else entirely. Taming is taking a wild animal and conditioning it to tolerate human presence, usually through hand-rearing. A tamed animal is still wild underneath, and then there is something in between, something that doesn't have a clean word for it. Commensal living. When a wild species begins to exploit the habitat that humans create, not because humans capture or breed them, but because the ecological math simply works in their favour. Cats almost certainly started in that third category. Not domesticated, not tamed, just opportunistic, in the quiet and effective way that small predators tend to be opportunistic. Big cats were never going to do this. A lion or a leopard in proximity to a human settlement is a catastrophe, not a convenience. The scale is wrong, the danger too high, the cost of close contact too obvious and immediate, but a small wild cat, roughly the size of the rodent's natural predator, appearing at the edge of a settlement where grain is stored and rodents are gathering, that's not a threat. That might actually be useful. And at some point, probably not with any grand intention on either side, that edge distance began to shrink. Not quickly, not cleanly, but it began. And that beginning is where everything that followed was quietly, patiently rooted. Imagine one of those first real villages in the Fertile Crescent. Not a city, not yet. Just a cluster of houses made from mud brick or packed earth, low walls, flat roofs, smoke rising from cooking fires in the cool of the morning. Around it, patches of ground scratched into something like fields. Not wild grass anymore, but stands of barley and einkorn wheat, coaxed into density by hands and stone tools and long, careful watching of the seasons. The harvest changes everything. For most of human history before this, food was something you moved to find. You followed the plants as they ripened, the herds as they shifted. Now more and more often the grain comes to you and you keep it. You cut it, thresh it, dry it, stack it. You gather it in baskets and clay-lined pits and purpose-built rooms. You build granaries. Grain in one place for months at a time, in quantities no wild landscape ever offers on its own. To us that sounds like security. To a rodent it is something else. It is a miracle. Whatever species of small, seed-loving mammals were around those first villages, and there were many, would have discovered the granaries quickly. Noses are good at that. Gnaw marks appear at the base of storage jars. Small tunnels are chewed through mud brick walls. Night sounds change. More skittering, more rustling in the dark corners, the little scratching feet of animals who have just won the evolutionary lottery. This is the point where, in other domestication stories, humans step in with intention. You can almost hear the Neolithic version of a town meeting. These pests are eating our food. We must do something. We will invent traps, cultivate predators, enforce storage rules. But with cats, the story bends a different way, because the people don't have to invite the predators invite themselves. Out in the scrub and the rocky edges of those same valleys, African wildcats are doing what they have done for thousands of years, hunting small rodents where small rodents gather. Their lives are governed by scent trails, by the sound of a rustle in dry grass, by the flicker of movement in moonlight. A wildcat does not need to understand agriculture to understand what a granary is. It only has to follow the mice. So the first wildcats come in quietly, probably at night, maybe hugging the shadow line where firelight fades and darkness begins. They do not announce themselves. They don't need to. They slip under fences, over low walls, through gaps in whatever passes for a perimeter. For them, these new human villages are simply new patches of hunting ground, dense, rich, strangely sweet with grain dust and human smell. We cannot see those first encounters, but we can imagine the shape of them. A person waking in the middle of the night hearing a commotion near the grain store, stepping out with a torch expecting rats, snakes, some other problem, seeing instead a small striped animal bolt away, leaving behind a limp mouse on the dirt. Is that animal an enemy? A thief? It's not eating the grain. It's eating the animals that eat the grain. That makes the equation less clear. This is where tolerance comes in. Domestication through breeding, the way dogs or cattle experienced it, depends heavily on human choice. You select the tamest, the most useful individuals. You mate them, you cull others. You do this for generation after generation until the animal is shaped to your preferences. But in this early phase with wildcats, something subtler is happening. Humans are not selecting cats so much as they are deciding again and again not to drive them away, not to throw stones when a wildcat is seen near the grain store, not to kill the female and her kittens sheltering behind a wall, because the mice around that wall seem fewer. On the cat side, there is an equivalent choice. African wildcats vary, just like any wild population. Some are more fearful, some more bold. Some will flee at the faintest trace of human scent. Others will linger a little closer, accept the background noise of people as the price of exceptional hunting. The ones capable of living nearer human spaces without panicking will be the ones who gain access to those rodent-rich granaries. They will eat better. They will raise more kittens. Over time, those kittens will inherit temperaments just slightly more tolerant of humans than their strictly wild cousins. It doesn't take anyone planning this for evolution to notice. This kind of quiet mutual tolerance, humans allowing some wildcats to live near them, wildcats allowing some level of human proximity in exchange for food, is probably the earliest selection pressure that begins nudging cats along the path toward what we would eventually call domestic. Not obedience, not control, just a narrowing of distance. Archaeology, as always, arrives later, trying to reconstruct what actually happened from fragments. Bones, DNA. The placement of remains in relation to ancient walls and hearths. Genetic studies suggest that all domestic cats alive today descend primarily from Near Eastern populations of Felis sylvestris libica. That points back to regions very much like these early farming communities, somewhere between about 9 and 10,000 years ago, perhaps a bit earlier, perhaps a bit later, depending on which data set you lean on. The timing overlaps almost perfectly with the rise of settled agriculture in the Fertile Crescent. That's not a coincidence most researchers think is accidental. But when exactly do we cross the line from wildcat who likes granaries to house cat? That is where the debates start, and where the story stays pleasingly blurry. A cat skeleton found in a settlement does not automatically mean domestication. Wild animals die in human spaces all the time. Bones move, get dragged, get reburied. The shape of the skeleton can help. Domestic animals often show subtle differences in size, in robustness. But cats are tricky. Early domestic cats and wild cats look very similar. Too similar in many cases for the bones alone to give a clear answer. So some researchers look for other clues. For changes in population density, lots of cat remains in a small area, which might suggest a sustained commensal population rather than a few chance visitors. For cut marks that might indicate skinning for fur, or for pathological changes that hint at living lives different from fully wild hunters. Increasingly, they look at ancient DNA, trying to track the spread of specific wildcat lineages into and alongside human populations over time. Even with all those tools, the picture that emerges is not a single moment of invention. There is no year zero for the house cat. No one night when a human child picks up a wild kitten, carries it inside, and history pivots. That might have happened. It probably did many times in many villages. But each of those tiny private moments is folded into a much older, slower pattern. Wild cats following prey, humans allowing it, both sides discovering that the arrangement works. If you want a contract here, you will not find one. There are no signatures, no oaths, no early laws carved into stone proclaiming "let the cats be fed for they protect our stores." There is instead something almost like a tide. Rodents rise with agriculture. Wild cats drift in after them. Human patience holds, more often than not. Generation after generation, the border between village and hunting ground becomes more porous, especially for one particular small predator. By the time we start to see clearer, touchable evidence of this relationship, bones carefully buried alongside human graves on a certain Mediterranean island, the alliance is already old, not formalized, not fully domesticated, but established. A partnership formed not out of affection or command, at least not at first, but out of a shared interest in the hum of a life around stacked grain, a quiet agreement, written in paw prints and missing mice. If you were to look for the first moment when this long, vague understanding between humans and cats hardens into something you can actually point to, something you could lay a finger on in a museum case, you would probably find yourself on an island. Cyprus, 9,000, maybe a little more years ago. The dates slide slightly depending on the calibration curves and which lab you're listening to, but they all cluster in that early Neolithic window, when villages and granaries are no longer experiments but ways of life. People here are already farming, already storing grain, already living in houses that had predecessors and will have descendants, and somewhere in one of those settlements a person died. We don't know who they were, male, female, old, young, the specifics blur. What we do know is where they ended up, in a shallow grave, carefully dug, the body placed with some attention, not tossed like rubbish, and, a short arm's length away from the human bones, on the same level, in the same cut of earth, a cat. Not just a random scattering of animal remains, not midden trash, a whole skeleton, intact enough that you can see the shape of a small, wild-looking feline, curled in death beside its human neighbour. This is the Schiller-Acambos burial, one of the most famous early signs of what might, possibly, be a relationship that has stepped beyond simple tolerance. Archaeologists have pored over it, because that is what archaeologists do. They measure the distance between skulls. They look for signs that the grave was dug in a single episode, not reopened later. They check whether the grave fill is the same above human and cat, whether the layering suggests the two bodies were put in the ground at roughly the same time. The answer, as far as careful excavation can tell, is yes. It looks like a double burial, a person and a cat, deliberately placed together. What does that mean? This is where the story gets interesting, but also where it must be told gently. Because bones, by themselves, do not come with captions. They do not whisper, "I was loved," or "I was a pest," or "I was a symbol of something sacred." They simply lie there, and we look, and we interpret. The tempting reading is the simplest. You see a cat buried next to a human and you think, pet, companion, someone who mattered enough that, when their person died, they were killed or interred with them as an offering, or as a friend sent along into whatever afterlife these people imagined. That might be true. It is one of the better supported interpretations. Shared burials are not common accidents. You do not usually find a wild animal, whole and articulated, lying neatly beside a human body unless something more than chance has arranged it. But there are other possibilities. Maybe the cat was not a pet, in the modern sense, but an animal with a special job, a kind of living tool, valued for its rodent hunting in the granaries nearby. When its human caretaker died, the community might have decided that this useful creature should go with them, or that it should be offered to whatever powers presided over death and grain and household fortune. Maybe the cat was symbolic. Many early farming societies seem to have had complex ideas about animals as mediators between worlds, as representatives of fertility, protection, or danger. It is not hard to imagine a culture in which a small predator that guards your precious stored food also comes to stand in stories and rituals for watchfulness, for boundary keeping, for the thin line between feast and famine. A cat buried with a human, in that case, might be more like a carved amulet than a beloved family member. Or perhaps, as so often happens in real life, it was all three at once. A useful animal that you also felt fond of, that also carried meanings larger than itself. The bones cannot tell us which of these readings is correct. What they can tell us is that by this time, somewhere around the early 8th millennium BC, cats and people on Cyprus were close enough, socially, physically, that someone decided it was appropriate to lay their bodies down together in the earth. And the simple fact that this is Cyprus matters. Wildcats do not swim to islands. Felis sylvestris libica, agile and adaptable as it is, does not cross open seawater in its spare time. During the last glacial maximum, sea levels were lower, coastlines were different, but Cyprus still sat offshore, without a natural land bridge in the period when people began to settle it. So when you find a cat buried on Cyprus, from a time when humans are already there, farming and storing grain, there is a quiet implication. This animal did not arrive alone. It came on a boat. Maybe it wasn't planned in the way we imagine. No one needed to post a sign saying "now boarding cats." A pregnant female could have slipped on with a load of grain, following mice as she always had. Kittens could have emerged later in the new settlement, and people already used to wild cats skulking around their granaries back on the mainland might simply have allowed them to stay. But the numbers, over time, start to push the scenario toward intention, or at least semi-intention. Early Neolithic Cyprus yields multiple felid remains. Other islands later show the same pattern. Cats do not appear immediately the moment humans do, but once they arrive, they linger, enough that you can talk about a resident population rather than a single lost stowaway. That suggests repeated transport. People either liked having these animals around enough to bring them, or liked grain enough that they accidentally imported the whole grain-rodent cat package and then did nothing to dislodge the final link in the chain. In that way, Cyprus becomes a kind of laboratory for the human-cat relationship. Islands do that. They sharpen boundaries. You can see in compressed form interactions that on the mainland are spread out and harder to trace. On Cyprus, at this early date, we see a few key things at once. We see settled farmers with granaries. We see evidence for rodents taking advantage of that. We see cats, genetically and morphologically very close to Near Eastern wildcats, now present on an island they could only have reached with human help. And in at least one striking case, we see a cat laid in the ground as if its body belonged within the same funerary space as a human's. Is that domestication? Here, definitions matter. If by domestication you mean a full suite of physical changes, smaller body size, different coat patterns, altered skull shape, a clear divergence from wild ancestors, the answer is probably not yet. The Chaluricambos cat and others of its era look very much like wild cats. Ancient DNA, where we have it, still places them close to wild populations, without the later genetic signatures that spread with fully domestic cats. If instead you mean a social shift, a relationship in which an animal is regularly living near humans, benefiting from human-made environments, and being, at least sometimes, deliberately favoured or protected, then Cyprus looks very much like part of that process. Archaeologists tread carefully here. They talk about commensal pathways, about animals that become human-adjacent before anyone consciously breeds them. They warn against reading our modern categories backward. A cat that sleeps near a hearth and eats your pests but is never stroked, never named, never restricted from breeding with wild cousins, is neither quite wild nor quite domestic in the way we use the words now. The island burials, the transported populations, sit right in that grey zone. We can say with some confidence that by 9,000 years ago, people in at least one early farming village thought cats were creatures worth living with, and in one grave, worth dying with. We can say that humans were, intentionally or not, moving cats across water, seeding them into new landscapes where granaries and rodents already waited. We cannot say yet that these were pets, as we understand the term, though they might have been. We cannot insist they were sacred animals, though later history will make that interpretation tempting. We cannot be sure how many people in those villages felt affection toward them, and how many simply tolerated them as a useful presence. What we can feel, through the soil and the stone and the gaps in our knowledge, is that the relationship is tightening. From loose, nighttime visitors around mainland granaries, to boat passengers, to grave companions on an island in the eastern Mediterranean. The wildcat is still mostly wild. The human is still mostly a farmer with practical concerns, but between them something is taking shape, an invisible line of association that will, in a few thousand years, glow with temples and myths and household shrines along another great river on another patch of fertile silt where cats will step fully into the light of recorded history. For the moment, though, we're still in the half-dark. An island, a grave, a quiet, curled body beside another. The earliest trace we can touch of a bond that is not yet finished becoming itself. Follow that invisible line of association east and south, and it will set you down eventually on the banks of a much larger river. The Nile. Here the pattern that began around scattered granaries and little island villages swells into something broader and more intricate. The quiet alliance between humans and cats is no longer a barely visible strand. It's woven into the daily rhythm of a civilization that depends on grain the way lungs depend on air. Along the Nile, life moves to a careful, pulsing schedule. The river rises and falls, the flood comes, spreads its dark silt across the floodplain, then retreats, leaving behind a strip of astonishing fertility bordered by desert on both sides. People learn to read this pulse with a precision that borders on obsession. They dig canals, mark flood levels, time their sowing and harvest to the river's moods. Grain is everything here. It is wages, rations, offerings to the gods, insurance against the years when the water rises too high or not quite enough. Fields of barley and emmer cut and bundled become stacks of stored wealth in mud brick granaries that line the edges of temples, estates and village courts. And wherever you pile up food in the thousands of kilograms, other creatures take notice, rodents especially. Fat mice, nimble rats, plump gerbils in the outer reaches. To them, an Egyptian granary is a miracle, walls to keep out big predators, roofs to soften the sun, and underneath, endless seed. In that world, a small, efficient carnivore that slips easily between jar stands and grain baskets is not an optional extra. It's part of the infrastructure. So if you imagine an ordinary day in a village along the Nile around, say, the Middle Kingdom, you can picture cats without straining. They're there at the thresholds, in the storage rooms beneath the raised floors. A woman grinding grain may pause, absent-mindedly flicking a scrap toward a cat watching from the doorway. A scribe copying accounts of harvested barley may glance up as a striped tail disappears between pots. Children may learn early that there are certain animals you do not chase or tease because they have work to do that matters to everyone. The sources that survive, paintings, reliefs, little carved figures, show us glimpses of this. Cats crouched under chairs during banquets, cats sniffing at fish offered on plates. Sometimes they are underfoot in scenes of domestic life. Sometimes they are almost participants, shown with collars, sometimes even on leashes, placed on boats as if they too are members of the household travelling upriver. From a purely practical standpoint, none of this is mysterious. Cats fit the niche perfectly. They keep rodents in check. They may deter snakes. They thrive in the narrow strip of settlement where human refuse and stored grain create a year-round buffet. People who live in that strip learn that allowing cats to hover at the edges of their homes is a good strategy. But Egypt does something more with this arrangement. Over time, in the dense symbolic ecosystem of Egyptian religion, cats begin to crystallize meanings. In a world where nearly every animal species can be linked to some facet of divine power, falcons to kingship, crocodiles to dangerous strength, cows to fertility and nourishment, the small, alert, protective cat finds its correspondences too. One of the central figures in this constellation is Bastet. Bastet is not born fully formed as the sleek domestic cat goddess most of us picture now. Early on, she appears with more explicitly leonine aspects, part of a cluster of feline deities that include formidable lion-headed goddesses like Sekhmet. These beings are not gentle. They embody the scorching sun, plague, war, the punishing heat that can wither crops and lives alike. Over centuries, though, Bastet's emphasis shifts. She does not lose her sharpness entirely, but she becomes increasingly associated with the household, with women, with music and joy, with the protective warmth of the hearth, rather than the blazing cruelty of the desert. The lioness melts, in imagery, into the smaller, more approachable cat. It is not hard to see why. A cat in an Egyptian house is a guardian that is also part of the family landscape. It kills the mice that would nibble your bread and the snakes that might threaten your child, but it also sleeps in the shaded corner, washes itself in the dust motes of afternoon purrs. Yes, most likely purrs, on the lap of whoever is calm enough to sit still and allow it. Bastet comes to gather all of that into one complex symbol, guardian of the home, watcher in the night, but also embodiment of softness, sensuality, and the small domestic joys that make life bearable. At her main cult centre in Bubastis, in the Delta, festivals in her honour would later draw enormous crowds. Ancient commentators describe scenes of almost wild celebration, music, drinking, boatloads of pilgrims arriving to take part. Somewhere behind those descriptions, in the shadows of the temple precincts, were living cats. We do not know exactly how they were treated, how free they were to come and go, how much they were handled. But we do know that Egyptian art and archaeology give cats a presence, unlike almost any other domestic animal. They are not just beasts of burden or anonymous offerings. They are individuals in paintings. They are companions in tomb scenes, placed under chairs the way you might tuck in a beloved dog in later European art. And then there are the mummies. Hundreds of thousands of mummified cats have been found in Egypt. whole cat cemeteries, layers of tiny wrapped bodies stacked in galleries near temples associated with Bastet and other feline deities. Some are carefully swaddled, with painted faces or intricate patterns in the bandages. Others, especially in later periods when demand seems to have been higher, are more hurriedly prepared. Some bundles, when x-rayed, prove to contain only partial skeletons, or even just a few bones. What does this mountain of feline dead tell us? One common, older story paints it simply. Egyptians worshipped cats, saw each one as sacred, mourned them extravagantly and mummified them like family members. There is some basis for parts of this. We do have texts suggesting that killing a cat even accidentally could draw harsh penalties. We have evidence that when a household cat died, family members might shave their eyebrows as a sign of grief. We see in tombs cat burials that appear individual and cared for, but the mass cat cemeteries convey a slightly different, more complicated picture. Many of these animals seem to have been bred or gathered as votive offerings, physical prayers in fur and linen. A pilgrim visiting a temple might pay for a cat to be ritually killed, mummified, and buried in honour of the goddess, much as later worshippers might light candles or leave figurines at a shrine. In that sense, cats were both revered and used. They were vehicles through which humans tried to communicate with powers beyond themselves. They were sacrificed in service of those relationships, their bodies piling up in the dark beneath temple floors. To modern eyes, that can feel unsettling, even contradictory. How can an animal be sacred and also expendable? But in many religious systems that duality is normal. A creature can represent the divine, stand as a bridge between worlds, and still be killed as an offering. Reverence is not always the same as affection. Symbolism is not always kindness. So when we think about Egyptian cats, it helps to hold multiple truths at once. They are working animals, hunting rodents in fields, barns and granaries. They are companions, shown on beds and under chairs, sometimes collared, perhaps sometimes named, present in scenes of leisure as well as labour. They are symbols, embodiments of Bastet's watchful presence and of the general principle of protection, the idea that the household, fragile in the face of flood and famine and disease, might be encircled by sharp eyes and swift claws, and they are at times commodities within a religious economy, raised and killed in large numbers so that each small body can stand for a specific petition, a particular act of devotion. The evidence for all this is strong in some places, thin in others. Artistic conventions are not photographs. A cat in a tomb painting may represent a generalized concept rather than a beloved individual. Texts are selective, written by and for people with specific agendas. Archaeology shows us the end states, mummies in their thousands, but not always the lived reality that produced them. Modern scholars, aware of how easily Egypt can become a screen for our fantasies, warn against going too far. The idea that Egyptians universally adored cats the way modern cat enthusiasts do is tempting but likely too simple. Love, in the intimate, personal sense, is hard to fossilize. So is casual cruelty. The archaeological record does not tell us how often cats were kicked, ignored, pampered, or tolerated with mild annoyance. What we can say, without much fear of overstatement, is that in ancient Egypt the human-cat relationship steps into clear focus. Here, more than anywhere else so far in our journey, cats are visible as integral parts of a sophisticated agricultural system, as agents in a religious imagination, and as quiet fixtures of everyday life. The wild cat that once slipped into early granaries on the fringes of the Fertile Crescent now curls in painted bedrooms, stalks among hieroglyphs, and lies wrapped in linen in temple catacombs. It has not changed much in bone and gene. Egyptian cats, even at this stage, look remarkably like their Near Eastern wild ancestors. But socially, it has crossed a threshold. From the Nile Valley, this new, layered version of the cat, hunter, household spirit, sacred symbol, will not stay put. Boats leave Egyptian harbours every season, laden with grain, linen, wine, papyrus, and people. And somewhere in the shadows of those decks, in baskets or darting between coils of rope, are cats, carrying their own small history outward, toward new coasts and new stories. When you stand on that harbour and watch the boats pull away, it's easy to focus on the obvious cargo: jars of grain, bundles of flax, carved stone, polished wood. The official reasons anyone bothers to cross water. The unofficial passengers are quieter. Once cats are thoroughly entangled with Egyptian grain, they are almost inevitably entangled with Egyptian trade. You cannot store shiploads of food without drawing shiploads of mice. And ships, like granaries, are bounded worlds packed with calories. There are seams in the planking where a paw can slip, coils of rope that make perfect ambush cover, holes full of sacks that rustle with subtle, inviting sound. So as Egyptian merchants move along the Nile Delta and out into the eastern Mediterranean, as diplomats travel with gifts for foreign courts, as soldiers are ferried to distant garrisons, cats find themselves presented with an opportunity they have never had before to ride the currents of regional commerce. They don't go as envoys, of course. No one is making formal decisions like, "We will now export cats." It happens the way most of their history happens, through convenience and habit. A cat that hunts well in the household of a ship's captain is not left behind lightly. A litter of kittens born near the docks is not immune to the charms of warm decks and the smell of fish. A sailor tires of mice in his bedding and bribes a temple worker or granary overseer to let a young cat wander down to the quay. We do not have a neat document that says, on this date cats arrived in Cyprus or Crete or the Levant. The evidence is scattered. A bone here, a painted fragment there, a sentence in a later text. Archaeologists find cat remains in ports and coastal settlements around the eastern Mediterranean that date to the late 2nd and early 1st millennium BCE. The timeline is fuzzy, but the pattern is clear enough. Where grain and ships concentrate, sooner or later the cats appear. And when Egyptians send out more than food, when they send prestige, imagery, religious ideas, the feline halo around Bastet travels too. Artistic motifs echo and mutate. A sleek seated cat carved in Egypt may inspire a more stylized version in a Phoenician workshop, which in turn feeds into Greek decorative patterns. You begin to see small felines slipping, almost unnoticed, into the borderlands of other people's art. By the time Greek writers are taking a serious interest in Egypt, they have noticed that their hosts treat cats with a kind of seriousness. Herodotus, writing in the 5th century BCE, reports that Egyptians feel deep distress at the death of household cats, and describes, with a mixture of fascination and skepticism, their grief and their burial customs. His tone is that of a man pointing at a cultural difference and turning it over in his hands. To him, this is exotic. At home, people do not generally shave their eyebrows for a dead animal. In Greece itself, the pest control niche is already crowded. For many centuries, the primary small predators humans rely on are not cats, but weasels, polecats, and their cousins, lithe mustelids that slip into barns and storerooms with lethal efficiency. Dogs, too, handle a broad spectrum of tasks: guarding, herding, some hunting of vermin. When cats begin to appear more regularly in the Greek world, they slot in quietly rather than explosively. The attitudes that form around them are correspondingly muted. In Greek texts where cats are mentioned, they are often just one small animal among many. They may be kept as pets, noted for their playfulness and grace, but they are not yet surrounded by the dense symbolic thicket that grew up along the Nile. There is curiosity, some admiration, a certain appreciation for their hunting, but not large cults or festival barges full of worshippers. Rome, later, is similar in some ways and different in others. The Romans inherit a world already crisscrossed by trade routes, where cats have had centuries to seep into port towns and inland markets. They also inherit a set of expectations about working animals. Dogs for Romans are famously versatile. They guard villas and camps, track game, and serve as companions. Ferrets and related mustelids are used deliberately for rabbit hunting and vermin control. When cats appear in Roman mosaics and household objects, they're often depicted hunting birds or mice, sometimes curled at the feet of a figure, sometimes perched under a table, eyeing a fish. Roman authors mention them, but again not with Egyptian fervour. They're useful, they're beautiful, they're occasionally emblematic of cunning or independence, but they are not central to Roman religious life. No Senate decrees are passed in their honour. No massive temple complexes are given over to their cult. What does change, quietly, is the architecture of opportunity. As Greek and then Roman cities grow, so do their piles of stored food and refuse. Multi-storey apartment blocks, crowded insulae with stacked families and shared courtyards, create layered niches where rodents can flourish. Granaries for armies, Annona warehouses for urban grain distributions, estates with vast storage jars and wine cellars. All of these reproduce again and again the same simple equation. Concentrated calories plus limited predators equals rodents. Cats sit at one end of that equation like an answer waiting for a problem. They do not need corridors built to their scale. They do not require special handling techniques like ferrets. They are content to patrol rafters and alleys, the gaps between amphora, the dim undersides of stairwells. A cat that proves itself valuable in an urban home will be tolerated, maybe even encouraged with scraps. A cat that haunts the edge of a granary will find enough to live on whether anyone feeds it or not. Slowly, city by city, this pattern replicates. The archaeological trail is faint but present. There are cat bones in wells and rubbish pits, in domestic contexts alongside chicken and pig and dog. There are images in wall paintings and floor mosaics, a cat pouncing on a bird, a cat coiled near a bowl of fish, a cat playing with a captured mouse. There are occasional grave goods, small bronze or terracotta figurines that freeze the cat's form into an object that can be handled, gifted, or buried. The written sources scattered across centuries add a few strokes of colour but leave wide gaps. We do not have a Roman manual that says, "Here is how you keep cats in the city." We infer from a combination of absences and presences. The pests were there, the cats were there, the cities continued to store grain without collapsing entirely into infestations. Something in that triangle of need, opportunity, and animal behaviour was working. What binds all these developments together is not conquest in the dramatic sense. No general is marching with a legion of cats, but commerce, logistics, and the humble needs of daily survival. Ships carry grain, and with it the creatures that threaten it, and the creatures that hunt those creatures. Diplomats and traders move between courts, bringing gifts, curiosities, and animals that catch the eye. A noblewoman in a Greek port might see an Egyptian-style cat in a merchant's house, and decide she wants one too. A Roman officer posted in a coastal town where cats are common might bring one home when his term ends. Each small decision is a thread. Over generations the threads weave into a net that spans the Mediterranean basin. In that net, cats are not conquerors but hitchhikers, passengers on human ambitions. They ride in the wake of wheat, oil and wine, drifting from the Nile delta into the Aegean, from Levantine harbours into Italian ports, from bustling emporia into inland towns along river routes. By the time the classical world reaches its height, the idea of a cat as an urban presence is no longer strange. It is simply part of the background hum of city life. Carts rumbling over stone, water sloshing in amphorae, voices in many languages, and somewhere in the alleys and granaries, the soft, nearly invisible work of small predators following the same fundamental bargain they struck millennia before. As trade lines thicken into true networks, stretching beyond the Mediterranean into deserts and over mountain passes, that quiet movement will continue. Cats will follow the caravans the way they followed the boats, stepping from one human world into another, always where the food is stored, always where the mice have learned to feast. When roads begin to matter as much as harbours, the pattern hardly changes. Only the scenery does. Instead of docks and quays, picture dusty caravanserais where stone walls hold back the desert wind, storage rooms piled with sacks of grain and dried fruit, courtyards where camels kneel and snort, shaking out bells and harness, traders unrolling bolts of cloth, opening chests of beads, weighing spices that seem impossibly fragrant after days of grit and glare. If you look down, instead of up at the camel loads, you start to see the familiar shapes. A streak of movement along the shadowed base of a wall. A small form slipping under a half-closed door, the glint of eyes from a roof beam, watching, waiting for the scurry that means dinner. Overland routes, the great webs that later generations will call the Silk Roads, although silk is only one bright thread among many, are not just lines on a map. They are strings of little artificial ecosystems, spaced a day's journey apart. Wells, stables, granaries, kitchens, inns where scraps fall and piles of fodder accumulate, markets where grain is poured from sack to sack, spilling a little every time. Anywhere you concentrate food, you concentrate rodents, and anywhere you concentrate rodents, given enough time and human patience, you invite cats. We don't have a moment where someone announces, "We will now equip every caravan with cats." But the same quiet calculus that played out in ships and port cities plays out again on land. A cat that has learned to live between camel legs and under wagons is useful. It hunts in the storehouse at night and sleeps in a merchant's tent by day. It avoids hooves with an instinct that looks like magic but is really just practice and quick reflexes. If a caravan master notices fewer holes in the grain sacks and fewer droppings in the flour, that cat is fed, tolerated, maybe even gently encouraged to stay. At an inn on a desert edge, a similar story unfolds. Travellers arrive with their own small predators tucked among the baggage, or following along at a loose distance, moving from one safe food source to the next. Some stay behind when the caravan moves on. Some are born there and never know any world except the ring of stone walls, the smell of beasts, the constant turn of new languages and faces. Over years and then centuries, cats do what they always do in human spaces. They form loose, shifting colonies centred on dependable food. A caravanserai that stands for 100 years shelters not just people passing through, but generations of small, striped hunters who learn the patterns of arrival and departure, the rhythms of breakfast and nightfall. The overland networks that connect the eastern Mediterranean to Mesopotamia, Iran, Central Asia, and beyond are older than the word Silk Road. Some grow out of Bronze Age trade in metals and timber, others from earlier pastoral paths that follow grazing cycles. Exactly when cats become a regular presence along these routes is difficult to pin down. Bones travel poorly in dry soils. Written records are more interested in taxes, kings, and luxury goods than in who is catching the inn's mice. What we have instead are hints. In some Near Eastern and Central Asian sites, cat remains start to appear in contexts associated with settlements that sit on important overland corridors. Not the wild, solitary steppe cats haunting distant ravines, but animals with proportions closer to the Near Eastern wildcat turned household companion. In a few cases, isotope studies suggest diets rich in human-associated food. another sign that these are not entirely wild animals. There are also stories, much later, of cats in caravan towns, in bazaars, in roadside lodgings. By the time writers and travellers are describing these places in detail, cats are already part of the scenery. They slip in and out of descriptions the way they slip in and out of courtyards, assumed, unremarkable, yet always present. Some of those cats carry invisibly the legacy of Egyptian and Levantine lineages that moved first along coasts and then inland. Others carry the imprint of local wild populations, because as domesticated or semi-domesticated cats spread out along these inland routes, they meet cousins. In the mountains of Anatolia and Iran, in the rippling grasslands of Central Asia, in oases that fringe deserts, wild cats have been living their own lives for hundreds of thousands of years. They're wary, solitary, tuned to the smells and sounds of their particular landscapes. Now into those landscapes comes something new. Concentrations of food attached to human buildings, and cats that are less afraid of people than a truly wild animal would be. On the edges of caravan towns and small cities, the boundaries can blur. A female descended from village cat slips out into the scrub and mates with a wild tom. Their kittens return to the walls and roofs where the food is easy. A wild female, drawn by the smell of rats gorging on spilled grain, takes up residence in an abandoned outbuilding, and, over generations, her descendants lose their fear of human movement and noise. Genetic studies of modern domestic cats suggest that this kind of mixing happened more than once in more than one region. Some lineages seem stronger around the eastern Mediterranean, others in areas that correspond roughly to old overland trade hubs, others in South Asia and China. It looks less like a single wave rolling out from Egypt or Mesopotamia, and more like a series of overlapping ripples. Cats riding with merchants, soldiers and pilgrims, cats drifting in from the surrounding countryside, cats meeting, mating, and blending their histories together. Exactly where and when each of these interbreeding events took place is still very much an open question. Bones are sparse, DNA is patchy, and the roots themselves have shifted through time as empires rose and fell, as new passes opened and old wells dried up. Archaeologists and geneticists can point to patterns, to clusters of traits and timelines that make certain scenarios more likely than others, but the precise paths each feline ancestor walked or trotted in the back of a wagon are mostly lost. What remains is the broad outline. As human roads thickened from faint tracks into well-beaten arteries of trade, cats found their own ways to move along them. They did not need tickets or official status. They only needed stockpiles of grain and the flourishing rodent populations that followed. At way stations from Syria to Sogdia, from Persian caravan towns to Chinese frontier posts, they slipped into the same basic role. Quiet watchers of the night, guardians of sacks and storehouses, half-wild companions of people on the move. From a cat's point of view, the Silk Roads were never about silk or empire. They were a chain of promising hunting grounds, each separated by a day or two of padded footfalls or the warm sway of a wagon, one granary to the next, one inn to the next, riding the long, slow pulse of human travel deeper into the continents. Eventually, those inland paths would meet others at the edges of still more water. Ports on the Indian Ocean, the South China Sea, the distant Atlantic. And just as they had once stepped from riverboats to seagoing ships, the descendants of these caravan cats would find themselves invited, quietly, accidentally, onto decks again. The first time a cat walks up a gangplank, nobody writes it down. There is no decree, no naval regulation, no carved tablet that says, "From this day forward ships shall sail with claws and whiskers aboard." What there is grain, and grain means rodents, and rodents love ships. A wooden hull from the perspective of a mouse or a rat is not a symbol of human daring. It is a hollow log packed with food, sacks of wheat and barley, baskets of dried fruit, casks of oil with drips and leaks around the rims, crumbs worked into every crack of the planks, ropes that can be gnawed for nesting material, dark corners that never see the sun. As soon as people begin moving food across water in bulk, rodents find a way to come along. They slip up mooring ropes, hide in cargo, race along the timbers of piers and onto decks. Harbours become perfect launch pads, warehouses, drains, grain chutes. A ship that sleeps for a night at the dock may wake with a new, uninvited colony aboard. For early sailors and merchants, this is more than unpleasant. It is dangerous. A hole in a grain sack is a small thing, but hundreds of holes over a long voyage can mean the difference between arriving with a cargo and arriving with empty hands. Rats chewing through rope or nibbling at leather water bags turn risk into certainty. So somewhere along a Nile wharf, or a Levantine pier, or the low quays of a Greek island, a solution that has already proved itself on land simply climbs the last few planks to sea. A cat that has been living in a riverside granary discovers that the big wooden thing moored outside is just another kind of granary, with the added advantage that many of the mice have cornered themselves. Sailors notice. At first, perhaps, a cat is just tolerated, shooed away from the drying fish, but allowed to stalk along the cargo. Then, on the next trip, someone whistles softly as the line's made fast and pats their knee. The same cat, or one very like it, hops aboard without being invited twice. By the time Mediterranean trade is thick with merchantmen and oared warships, the pattern is in place. Rodents are endemic to ships. Cats become, if not mandatory, then very strongly encouraged passengers. Maritime life accelerates their movements in a way no caravan ever could. Overland, a cat rides a wagon for a day or two, then drops off at the next promising stop. At sea, the nearest shore might be days away. Once aboard, many cats stay with the crew for entire circuits, from the Nile Delta to the Levant, from Cyprus to Rhodes, from Antioch to Alexandria, over and over. Each time the ship docks, cats face a choice they are built to make very quickly and without fuss. Stay, where the food is predictable but the space is cramped, or slip down the mooring line onto a strange dock that smells of fish guts, tar, and unfamiliar cats. Some go, some stay. Either way, their genes move. In port after port, ship cats mingle with whatever feline population is already there. Sometimes that means meeting long-established harbour colonies, descended from local wild cats that learned to live on fish scraps and wharf rats generations ago. Sometimes it means stepping into almost empty niches where humans have only recently begun piling cargo at the water's edge. Across the eastern Mediterranean and into the Red Sea, the Black Sea, the Persian Gulf. This quiet mixing repeats with every sailing season. Later, it happens again on other waters. The Indian Ocean, with its monsoon-driven rhythms, the South China Sea, the stormy Atlantic. Ships are not only moving spices and cloth and ceramics, they are moving small striped predators, back and forth, continent to continent, with a regularity no land route can match. Life on board, for a cat, is full of sharp contrasts. There is monotony, the same decks, the same coils of rope, the same cramped sleeping places wedged between barrels or tucked under benches. There is abundance. On a good voyage, the bilges and storerooms are alive with prey. There is danger, sudden storms that send unsecured objects skidding, unexpected waves that sweep across the deck, heavy boots, falling tools, the ever-present risk of being shut into a sealed compartment. Sailors learn over time how to care for these strange shipmates that are neither crew nor cargo. In some traditions, cats are fed deliberately, scraps of fish, bits of offal, crusts dipped in broth. In others, the unspoken agreement is harsher, hunt or go hungry. But even there, A favoured mouser may find a hand reaching down with an extra morsel when the catch has been good. Water is rationed carefully at sea, yet a cat that has proved its worth may find its own bowl kept from spilling, its own shout in the daily routine of buckets and ladles. During storms, men who have faced down pirates may still pause to scoop a terrified cat into the relative safety of a coil of rope. Alongside the practical treatment, grow beliefs. In some cultures, a calm, contented cat on deck is taken as a sign of fair weather ahead. A restless, anxious one is watched like a living barometer. In others, a cat washing behind its ears is said to be calling rain, or turning its back to the sea is taken as a bad omen for the voyage. Stories accumulate. Cats that sense leaks before any human nose can smell the damp. Cats that refuse to sleep near a barrel whose contents later prove rotten. Cats that cling to floating wreckage and drift ashore as the sole surviving member of a crew. Whether all these tales are true matters less than the pattern they suggest. Sailors who live with risk pressed against their skin every day choose to see in these animals both practical allies and mysterious guardians. At night, when the ship is just a small, creaking island on an endless dark, a cat padding silently along the rail is more than pest control. It is another set of eyes, another wakeful presence that does not need to be told to keep watch. When those cats step off the gangplank into port cities, they walk into environments that suit them almost perfectly. Ports are edge places. They sit between land and sea, between local and foreign, between stability and constant change. They are full of warehouses, fish markets, stables, boarding houses, tanneries, piles of rope, heaps of broken pottery. They are also full of food waste and nesting materials and endless cracks and crevices. Rodents thrive there. So do cats. Over years, harbour districts develop their own feline communities. Not house pets exactly, though some individuals may claim a tavern, a bakery or a particular family as their main source of shelter. Not wild animals either, because they live almost entirely on human-created opportunity. These portside colonies are ancestors of what we now call street cats, loose, flexible groups tied more to places than to people, their social lives built around feeding spots, sheltered roofs, and the comings and goings of ships. Any time a vessel ties up, there is exchange. A kitten born in a warehouse rafters is scooped up by a sailor whose own ship has lost its mouser. A heavily pregnant queen, curious about a new smell, wanders up a plank and disembarks a week later at a city hundreds of miles away. A male cat that has ruled a quayside for 2 seasons vanishes one night and reappears weeks later on a different dock entirely, having ridden out and back again without asking anybody's permission. Through these small, unrecorded movements, feline lineages spread and blend. Genetic work on modern domestic cats hints at how tangled this web became. Mediterranean and Near Eastern lineages show up in Europe, in East Africa, even in parts of Asia reached by Indian Ocean trade. At the same time, in some regions, domestic cats carry signatures that match local wild populations more closely than distant imports. This suggests that ships and ports did not simply export one original domesticated strain to the whole world. Instead, they seem to have carried a limited set of early lineages outward, which then met and mingled with local wildcats again and again. In a busy harbour, that mixing might happen just a few miles from where an inland caravan route meets the sea. A ship cat, descended in part from Egyptian or Levantine stock, mates with a cat whose great-grandparents were almost entirely wild, drawn down from scrub or marsh by the irresistible buffet of a growing town. Their offspring move up into attics, out along wharves, maybe onto the next outbound vessel. How many of the lineages that ride these routes can be traced back to the first tamed cats of early granaries, and how many represent fresh threads woven in from local wild populations is still not fully clear. The genetic record is like a palimpsest, older writing overwritten by newer with only fragments of each legible. What does come through is the overall shape of the story. Wherever humans build dense, food-rich, rodent-laden environments at the water's edge, cats arrive. Wherever humans lash planks together and set out across rivers and seas with grain in their holds, cats follow. Sometimes invited, sometimes merely tolerated, but always finding the spaces in between. From ship decks to alleyways, from cargo holds to warehouse roofs, they become citizens of ports, creatures of thresholds who never entirely belong to one shore or one ship, one lineage or one origin story. And as those port cities feed empires and armies, and their ships push deeper into colder, more distant waters, the cats go with them, padding north along the arteries of an expanding world, towards stone roads, conquered lands, and quiet monasteries where new arrangements between humans and their small, patient hunters are waiting to unfold. The Roman world does not wake up one morning and decide to import cats. As with everything else in this story, they simply arrive, one soft-footed step at a time. From the south and east, ships bring them into ports that smell of wine and olive oil and wet rope. From overland routes, they drift in with caravans and baggage trains, slipping between sacks, hiding in supply depots. By the time the Roman Empire is a solid presence around the Mediterranean, cats are already there in the background, part of the quiet machinery that keeps grain, and therefore people, alive. Rome itself is a place where rodents should, by all rights, be running the show. Granaries line the Tiber. Warehouses overflow with wheat brought from Sicily, from North Africa, from Egypt. Tenement blocks are built of timber and crumbly brick, full of flaws and cracks and fallen crumbs. Sewers and drains offer covered highways. Every night the city hums with tiny gnawing teeth. Into this labyrinth move animals the Romans are quite familiar with, the weasel tribe, ferrets, polecats, martens, swift, flexible bodies that can twist into any gap. People keep them in granaries, in barns, sometimes in houses, as living traps with a taste for blood. Cats are different. They are less frenetic than a weasel, less willing to fling themselves into a blind, rattling chase through a wall. They watch, they listen, they pounce only when the odds are good. They're also far more inclined to sit on someone's lap, or curl in the sun on a threshold, or demand a share of whatever is in the cooking pot. So in Roman towns and villas, you begin to see a division of labour that nobody writes down as policy, but that nonetheless takes shape. In the darkest, most cramped corners, where a hand cannot reach and a broom cannot sweep, people still value weasels and their cousins. In more open, human-centred spaces, storerooms with shelves, kitchens, courtyards, the outer rooms of houses, cats slide into the role of visible guardians. They're not universal, and they are not always cherished. Some writers mention them in passing, some ignore them completely. A few mosaics and painted walls show sleek striped hunters with birds or mice clenched in their teeth. In Egypt, cats had statues and temples. In Rome, they appear more as working animals and occasional symbols of independence or cunning. We do not have a law code spelling out their status. We have fragments, bones in rubbish pits, paw prints left accidentally in drying tiles, a scratched inscription that may or may not have been about a beloved house cat. The record is broken and partial, like a manuscript with missing pages. From Rome, from its ports and its soldiers' camps, cats ride outward. They go north with legions marching along stone roads into Gaul and Britain, hiding in carts of supplies, following the same trails of grain that first pulled them into human lives. A fort on a windy frontier stocks its granaries just as carefully as a city in Italy. Those stockpiles draw mice, the mice draw cats. The cats find small warm corners in barracks, in officers' houses, in the cook houses that turn sacks of flour into daily bread. In these colder, wetter lands, the relationship between humans and cats shifts almost imperceptibly. Winters are harsher. Walls matter more. Livestock is often stabled indoors or under the same roof as people. Long, dark, smoky interiors are full of movement. Cattle shifting in their stalls, dogs dozing by the hearth, chickens picking at dropped grain, sometimes a tethered ferret or a trapped stoat taken on as a mouser. A cat that finds its way into such a mixed household enters a complex little ecosystem of cooperation and competition. Dogs keep watch and drive off strangers. Ferrets and their kin slink along beams and under floors, pressing rodents hard in the smallest spaces. Owls hunt outside at night, taking what they can in the yards and fields. Cats thread through all of this, neither as strong as a dog nor as specialized as a ferret, but able to operate in both daylight and dark, indoors and out, comfortable on a thatched roof and on a bed of straw by the fire. Sometimes they clash. A weasel will kill a kitten if it can. A cat will do the same in reverse. Dogs may chase cats or tolerate them, or sleep nose to tail with them. The arrangements vary from house to house, but over time in many regions a pattern emerges in which cats occupy the closer, more human parts of the dwelling, and other predators take the more marginal spaces. When the Western Empire fragments, the roads decay, and stone cities contract, cats do not vanish with the emperors. They simply allow their paths to bend. Some remain in the rubble and shrinking towns. Others follow grain into new centres of power, fortified manors, small markets, and especially monasteries. A monastery is, among other things, an organised food machine. Fields are worked, harvests are brought in, granaries are built and carefully tended. Bread is baked on a schedule. Casks and sacks and bins pile up in orderly rows. All of this is irresistible to rodents, and therefore to the animals that hunt them. We do not have monastic rule books filled with instructions on how to care for cats. What we do have are hints scattered across the centuries. In some medieval manuscripts, a tired scribe has scribbled a few private words in the margin about a cat who keeps him company in the scriptorium. A poem in Old Irish lovingly describes a scholar and his white cat keeping parallel vigils, the man over his books, the cat over mice. In another text, there is complaint about paws tracking ink across a carefully copied page. Occasionally, a sheet of parchment preserves something even more immediate, the faint marks of tiny claws, a blurred line where a tail, damp with who knows what, brushed the drying script. These are accidents, but they testify to a reality that no charter bothers to record. Cats were not just in the barns, they were in the very rooms where texts were being copied and illuminated. For a nocturnal hunter, a scriptorium must have been an interesting place. Warm from lamps and bodies, filled with rustling parchment and whispers, stocked with leather bindings and wooden chests that could hide nests of mice. It was both territory and playground. The monks benefited. Fewer rodents nibbling at precious books and stored grain. The cats benefited. Shelter, food, and, though they would not have called it this, a community. Around these religious houses in northern Europe, cats also slip out into the surrounding villages. Early medieval homes vary from region to region, but many share certain features. Central hearths, smoke-darkened beams, earthen or wooden floors scattered with straw, food tucked into chests and hanging from rafters. Inside, people sleep, talk, eat, weave, repair tools. Outside, animals crowd into byres and stables. Manure heaps steam in the cold. Middens spill scraps and bones. In some houses, cats are barely tolerated visitors, allowed in when the mice become unbearable, driven out when they steal a bit of meat or disturb the chickens. In others, they are part of the everyday cast of characters, with semi-stable spots by the fire or on the edge of the bed, slipping in and out through gaps in the walls. Where written records are sparse, archaeology steps in, but even that has limits. Cat bones in a pit do not clearly tell us whether their owner was cherished or simply useful, whether they died of old age under a bench, or were culled like any other working animal when they failed to perform. A collar buckle might hint at a more personal tie, but metal was valuable and rarely wasted. Most cats probably went through their entire lives without a single object that would survive 1,000 years. Regional attitudes also diverge. In some Germanic and Scandinavian stories, cats travel with goddesses, pulling chariots, watching the margins between wild and tame. In parts of the British Isles, they appear as household spirits, sometimes protective, sometimes ominous. In other places, they barely appear in myth at all, suggesting that they were too ordinary, too woven into daily life to attract much comment. Across this patchwork, one thing seems broadly true. By the later Middle Ages in Northern Europe, cats are firmly established indoors as well as out. They curl in cloisters and kitchens, chase mice under benches in great halls, watch from rafters in barns. They share space with dogs, with weasels, with barn owls, sometimes aligning with them in an unconscious alliance against rodents, sometimes competing fiercely, and as they draw physically closer to human bodies, sleeping on blankets, threading around bare ankles, climbing into cradles and onto tables, their presence at the edge of human imagination begins to change as well. The same animal that protects the grain and the books is now close enough to be seen in the corner of the eye at night, its eyeshine catching firelight in ways that feel a little too bright, its sudden focused stillness uncanny in a room full of movement. The groundwork is being laid for a different kind of story. A story in which cats are no longer just workers in the dark, but figures loaded with meaning, lucky or unlucky, sacred or suspect, companions or conspirators. From Roman storehouses to monastic scriptoria to smoky peasant hearths, their quiet, practical usefulness has brought them into the heart of Northern European life. In the next turn of the tale, that closeness will take on a sharper edge, as fear, rumour, and theology begin to wrap themselves around the shape of a small, watchful hunter whose eyes never quite look away. When people start to live with an animal, really live with it, share heat, food, dreams, and sickness, two stories always grow up side by side. One is practical. This creature kills mice, it tears meat, it purrs on my chest and warms my hands. The other is stranger. It speaks in symbols, not in facts. And cats, more than almost any other domestic animal, slide very easily into that second story. Part of it is simply how they move through the dark. Most creatures that share our houses either sleep through the night like we do, or they make such a racket that we always know where they are. Dogs shuffle, snore, bark. Chickens mutter and rustle on their perches. Pigs grunt and shift. A cat can be absolutely silent until the moment it chooses not to be. If you have ever fallen asleep with a cat in the room, you know this. Hours after the fire dies down, when the house is black and the world has shrunk to breath and heartbeat, and the occasional pop from the embers, something lands lightly at the foot of the bed. A soft thump, a small weight, then a slow walk up the length of your body. You feel the pause, but you hear almost nothing. In a world without streetlights, where night is thick and total, that kind of presence feels uncanny. Across many regions and centuries, you can see people circling around the same idea, that a cat belongs naturally to the borderlands, between day and night, between house and wild, between life and whatever lies just past it. Folklore is full of these border places, doorways, crossroads, thresholds, the exact line where one thing becomes another. Cats specialize in those lines. They sit in windows, on thresholds, in barn doors, They patrol the edges of fields and village fences. They're tame enough to come when there is a bowl of milk, wild enough to disappear for days and come back smelling of damp earth and leaves. In northern Europe, stories begin to notice this. In some tales from the Celtic fringes, a cat is not simply an animal, but a creature that can cross boundaries others cannot. It might sit on a corpse during a wake, and people will quietly ensure it is driven off, just in case it tries to steal the departing soul. In parts of the British Isles, there are beliefs about spectral or monstrous cats haunting the margins of moors and graveyards, exaggerated shadows perhaps spun out from ordinary barn cats seen at a distance, their eyes reflecting starlight. In Scandinavian tradition, cats sometimes travel with goddesses linked to love, fertility, and the household. Harnessed to a chariot or curled at her feet, they blur the line between farm animal and divine companion. They are not the main gods of thunder or war. They occupy a softer, more domestic sphere, but still one that can tip unexpectedly into magic. Elsewhere, very different cultures follow parallel lines of thought. In parts of the Islamic world, cats are often treated with gentleness, sometimes associated with cleanliness and mercy. Stories collect around famous religious figures and their fondness for particular cats. These stories are not the same as the northern legends about soul-stealing or corpse-sitting, but they still mark the animal as having special status, something more than simply another mouser in the yard. Farther east, in Japan, beliefs about beckoning cats, protective cat statues, and cats that can, in some tales, shapeshift into human form or monstrous spirits, all lean on the same raw material. An animal that watches quietly, appears suddenly, and seems to know more than it should. A cat perched on a roof beam in a dim house, its tail twitching, becomes the seed of 100 ghost stories. None of these motifs are truly universal. There are plenty of societies where cats remain mostly background characters, functional and unremarkable. But wherever people sleep within reach of that light, padded step, and wake at night to the feeling of being watched by reflective eyes at the edge of the fire, there is potential for the same ideas to bloom. Household magic is where these ideas turn into practice. For many families, a cat is an informal guardian, not in any official rite written down by priests, but in a web of small habits and sayings. A cat that chooses to sleep in the doorway is quietly allowed to stay there, as if its body itself strengthens the threshold. A cat who likes a particular corner of the barn may be said to keep that corner, and there is comfort in the thought that mice and perhaps worse things avoid it. In some regions, litter taken from a cat's usual sleeping place might be used in simple charms meant to protect a house or cradle, not because of a grand, systematized theory of magic, but because people have watched for generations. Where the cat feels safe, things seem to go better. Where a cat refuses to settle, something may be wrong. There are sayings about cats predicting weather by the way they wash their faces or the direction they sit to groom. A cat staring intently at an empty patch of air might be read as seeing spirits, or simply as listening to some faint scrabble of insect feet in the wainscoting. Folklore does not insist on one explanation. It lets the ambiguity stand. These beliefs also quietly record details that official documents never bother with. Chronicles tell us when kings are crowned, when battles are fought, when taxes are levied. They almost never talk about the way a cat circles 3 times before settling in the warm spot where a sick child is lying, or the habit of leaving a bit of porridge on the step for the house cat, who may or may not be a flesh and blood animal. Stories, on the other hand, remember. They remember that people watch their cats closely enough to notice patterns, that cats were welcome in birthing rooms as well as barns, that a bride's family in one place might consider it lucky if a cat followed her into her new home, while in another region, a cat in the wedding chamber would be hurriedly chased out for fear of bad fortune. Each custom, each prohibition, carries within it a shadow of daily life. What rooms existed, who used them, what was feared, and what was hoped for. Even tales that cast cats as dangerous often reveal tenderness around the edges. A story might warn that if you treat your cat badly, it will come back after death to torment you or twist your luck. Underneath that threat is an acknowledgement. This animal is close enough to you to notice your moods, to be hurt by your anger, to outlive the memory of a single quarrel. A superstition about never stepping over a sleeping cat or never waking it suddenly can be read as magical thinking, but also as a way of teaching children to move gently in a crowded, shared space. Through all of this, the cat remains a liminal creature. It is both tool and companion, wild and tame, comforting and unsettling. It moves easily through the layers of human imagination, picking up meanings as it goes: guardian, trickster, omen, healer, thief of breath, bringer of joy. Most of these roles are invented by us, of course. To the cat, a hearth is warmth, a human is a source of food and interesting smells, a dark attic is good hunting ground. But the very fact that we map so many ideas onto the same small body tells us something about ourselves. We're always trying to read the world around us as if it were a text, full of signs and signals. A dog with its open enthusiasm is easy to understand. A cat with its silence and its unreadable gaze resists us just enough that we keep trying. In that space between what a cat actually is and what we imagine it to be, folklore grows like ivy on an old wall. Soon, that ivy will twist into darker shapes. The same eyes that once promised protection and luck will, in some places and times, be read as evidence of something sinister. But before we step into the age of witch trials and bonfires, it is worth remembering this quieter landscape. Kitchens and barns and bedrooms where a cat on the threshold is simply a sign that, for tonight at least, the border between inside and outside safety and danger is being carefully watched by a creature who lives on both sides at once. For a long time, living with that border creature was mostly a comfort. Then the borders themselves began to shake. Famine, plague, war, religious upheaval. None of these are new in human history, but there are periods when they stack on top of one another, when the sense of ordinary predictability frays. In parts of late medieval and early modern Europe, the fabric of everyday life was pulled so tight that almost anything could become a surface for projected fear. Historians talk about moral panics, moments when a community's anxieties crystallize around a particular figure, a neighbor, an imagined enemy, a hidden conspiracy. Under those conditions, old stories about cats at thresholds and cats in birthing rooms do not disappear. They twist. Religion was part of this, but not in a simple, one-direction way. Christian authorities had for centuries been negotiating with a countryside full of older customs. Some clergy tolerated household magic, as long as it stayed small and unthreatening. Others tried to stamp it out. Manuals warning against sorcery occasionally mention animals as possible tools of demons. Not just cats, but toads, goats, birds. Anything that moved quietly in corners, anything already associated with luck or protection, could be reclassified as suspect. Cats, with their long history of liminal roles, fit that suspicion especially well. By the late Middle Ages, there are scattered references to cats being used in charms that church writers considered illicit. Sometimes the same animal that was thought to protect a house could be accused of drawing misfortune to a rival's home. That ambiguity, harmless enough when life is going well, becomes dangerous when crops fail or disease comes through the village and people start looking for someone to blame. The association between black cats and witchcraft that many people know today grows out of this tangle of fear, symbol, and rumour. Black, in European Christian symbolism, often carried connotations of sin, secrecy, the hidden. A black animal that moved easily through night lanes and back alleys, that slipped in and out of houses without asking permission was an obvious candidate for imaginative linkage with forbidden practices. In some regions, stories developed that a witch could turn into a cat, or that a demon would take the form of a cat to serve its human partner. How widely these beliefs were actually held by ordinary people is debated. The surviving sources, the trial records, the sermons, the demonology books, were mostly produced by literate elites with their own agenda. They show what certain judges, theologians, and inquisitors claim to fear. They do not necessarily map cleanly onto what every villager thought when they saw a cat in the lane at dusk. Still, when witch trials intensified between the 15th and 17th centuries, cats sometimes appeared in the testimonies. A woman might be accused not just of cursing a neighbour or spoiling milk, but of keeping a familiar spirit in animal form. In English and Scottish records, this familiar is often a small creature, a cat, a dog, a ferret, a toad. It feeds from the witch's body, so the story goes, and carries out her malice. Elsewhere in Europe, similar ideas appear under different names. The animal is no longer just a mouser. It has become a sign of secret alliance. The consequences for cats are hard to quantify precisely, but scattered reports and later legends describe the hunting and killing of them, especially during times of heightened fear. In some towns, cats were thrown into bonfires on festival days, a practice that may have older roots as rough entertainment, but that, in a climate of anxiety, could take on a symbolic edge. In other cases, cats belonging to accused people were themselves killed as evidence of corruption. Even if mass systematic exterminations are probably exaggerated in some retellings, there is little doubt that in certain places and moments being a cat, especially a black one, was riskier than before. Communities paid a price as well. Removing or persecuting an animal that had quietly controlled rodent populations for centuries had predictable effects. More rats and mice meant more damaged grain, more hunger. Some researchers have suggested links between anti-cat sentiment and the spread of disease, though here the evidence is more speculative and experts disagree on how strong the connection really was. What is clearer is the symbolic economy. By turning the household cat into a sign of evil, people lost one of their small nightly comforts, one of their familiar watchers at the edge of the bed. Yet even in the middle of this, other stories persisted. Not every region demonized cats to the same degree. In some Catholic communities, cats remained ordinary barn animals. In parts of the Mediterranean, they continued to be valued for pest control in ports and warehouses, largely untouched by northern fantasies about witches' familiars. In cities where trade and practical concerns were paramount, a good mouser might be too useful to sacrifice to ideology. Over time, as the great wave of witch persecutions ebbed, the sharpest fears dulled. Enlightenment writers mocked the credulity of earlier centuries. Urban life expanded. The same black cat that might once have been read as an omen began to be recast as a character in jokes, in nursery rhymes, in small tales told to children on winter evenings. The darker legends did not vanish. They lingered in sayings and superstitions. A black cat crossing the road as bad luck in one country, as good luck in another, the old ambivalence still flickering. But increasingly, especially in growing towns, another image rose to join them. The cat on a tavern step, the cat in a shop doorway, the cat patrolling the alleys behind a bakery. Fear and fire had tried to redefine the animal as an agent of chaos. The needs of crowded streets and overflowing granaries would slowly redefine it again. As a necessary worker, a familiar silhouette on the rooftops, and, eventually, a welcome presence in the private life of the home. From the ashes of bonfires and the fading echo of trial bells, the city cat was waiting to step forward. By the time Europe and parts of the wider world were filling with brick and timber and smoke, the cat had already rehearsed one of its oldest roles. it was ready for the city. Early modern towns, those dense growing places of the 16th, 17th and 18th centuries, were layered spaces, narrow streets, open drains, piles of refuse, grain lofts built over shops, warehouses stacked with food and fabrics and spices. At night, when shutters closed and human traffic thinned, other populations went to work. Rats and mice had followed grain and garbage into every quarter. They nested in cellars, chewed through sacks, ran along roof beams in counting houses and in the holds of moored ships. Officials worried about spoiled stores, merchants worried about profit, householders worried about that scratching in the walls. In this environment, the cat's usefulness was obvious in a way almost no doctrine could argue away. Taverns kept a house cat as casually as they kept a broom. Granaries and mills relied on small patrols of mouses to protect the harvest. Monasteries and guild halls that had weathered earlier centuries now sat inside thickening towns, and quietly, many of them kept cats as part of the furniture of daily life. Some cities even had informal traditions, a particular brewery famed for its fearless Tom, a bookseller whose shop always seemed to have a drowsing tabby on the counter. Sometimes this was a matter of contract as much as custom. There are scattered references in account books and letters to cats being maintained by an institution, or to a paid rat catcher arriving with his own trained animals, which might include terriers and occasionally cats. The line between wild and employed was porous. A cat could live almost entirely on street scraps, but be known by merchants along a whole lane as ours, given a name, slipped bits of food, gently shooed away only from the most delicate goods. The great epidemics of the period added another, darker layer to this picture. When plague flared in crowded quarters, people noticed the sudden stillness in the markets, the shuttered houses, the carts carrying away the dead. They also noticed rats, sometimes in great numbers. Exactly how people in different places connected these observations is still debated. Modern understandings of disease transmission did not yet exist. Explanations for pest and plague drew more on humours, bad air, or moral failing than on fleas and bacteria. Later storytellers would sometimes claim that earlier societies had driven away cats and thereby invited disaster, but the historical record is more complicated. In many port cities, even during outbreaks, cats remained common. They were not widely recognized as public health tools in any modern sense, yet they were kept because grain still needed guarding, and households still needed some small defense against gnawing teeth. If cats had any effect on disease patterns, it would have been indirect and variable, reducing some rodent populations here, failing to make a dent there. Historians are cautious about drawing straight lines between more cats and less plague. What can be said with more confidence is that, amid waves of sickness and recovery, the cat stayed close to the human food supply, shadowing us through the crisis years as it had shadowed us in earlier ages of famine and flood. Meanwhile, something quieter was happening behind closed doors. As urban life intensified, the idea of home began to change. In certain regions and social classes, there was a growing distinction between public and private, between the shopfront or office where one dealt with the world and the inner rooms where family life unfolded. Domestic interiors accumulated new objects: clocks, upholstered chairs, framed pictures, books. They also began, in some places, to accumulate animals that were not purely tools. Dogs followed this path in a very visible way. Lapdogs for nobles, hunting dogs for gentlemen, watch dogs for yards and gates. Cats moved along a related but slightly different track. In many households, the cat still earned its keep by hunting, but it also started to pick up an additional, softer function. A child growing up in a 17th century town might know the family cat as the creature that kept the pantry safe, and also as the warm presence that slept near the hearth, twitched in dreams, and tolerated being talked to when human listeners were busy. Written sources begin, tentatively, to reflect this shift. Diaries and letters mention "my cat," not only when it is useful, but when it dies, or falls ill, or does something amusing. Some writers apologize for the triviality of recording such things. Others do not, slipping a fond remark about a pet between discussions of trade and politics. Painters include cats at the feet of women reading or on the edge of a child's bed. The animal is still associated with domestic labour, spinning, weaving, storing food, but it is also simply present, a character in the scene, and still it never fully lost its street passport. Urban cats in this period occupied a semi-wild middle ground. Many ranged freely along rooftops and gutters, slipped in and out of multiple dwellings, and bred without human planning. A cat might sleep under a specific table every night, and still vanish for days on some inscrutable errand. It might be cherished indoors and yet know every alley's hidden path. This boundary life could be literal as well as symbolic. Cats used doorsteps, windowsills, and back garden walls as staging posts, hanging on the threshold between the controlled space of the home and the unpredictable life of the street. Neighbours shared cats the way they shared gossip. A creature could be hours in more than one house at once, without paperwork or ownership titles. Over time, in some places, this shared ownership began to tilt. The more a cat was invited to stay inside, the more it came to be thought of as belonging to a particular family. Sleeping on the bed instead of in the barn, being given a dish rather than scavenging entirely for itself, being named in a will or mentioned in a sentimental poem, all of these small signals mark a slow shift from pure utility to companionship. Not everywhere, and not all at once, but enough that by the late 18th and early 19th centuries, the idea of a house cat in the modern sense was no longer strange. At the same time, cities were becoming more self-conscious about their animal populations in general. Regulations about strays, concerns about noise and mess, and rising middle-class ideals of respectability all pushed toward more controlled, more deliberate relationships with domestic animals. Cats were caught up in this process. Some were culled as nuisances, others were deliberately sheltered, chosen, selected for temperament or appearance rather than just their hunting skill. Out of these choices, made in parlours and back kitchens and shop storerooms, the next phase of the cat's history began to form. People found themselves comparing notes. This one has unusually long fur, that one has striking markings, another seems unusually placid, happy to sit for hours on a lap. In an age already fascinated by classification and collection, of plants, of shells, of curiosities from distant lands, it was only a matter of time before someone applied the same impulse to the familiar animal on the hearth. The city had turned the cat into a practical necessity, a quiet co-worker among barrels and books. But it had also given humans reason to watch cats more closely than ever before, to notice their individual quirks, to talk about their colours and shapes with something like pride, out of packed streets, rattling carts, and the steady rustle of grain in lofts and warehouses. The idea of the cat as a chosen, cultivated companion was gathering. Soon, people would not only keep cats, they would begin to breed them, exhibit them, and write about them as distinct kinds, a new chapter in a very old relationship. In the 19th century, that vague sense of "this is my cat and it is somehow special" met a new kind of world. Industrial cities had not only factories and smoke, they also had something earlier centuries rarely afforded to many people at once: pockets of leisure, office hours, half-days, evenings with gaslight and not much to do. There were newspapers hungry for copy, societies forming around every imaginable interest, clubs devoted to ferns, to postage stamps, to pigeon racing. the same culture that numbered and labelled rocks and beetles began to turn its gaze indoors. Pets, which had quietly woven themselves into family life, became subjects of conversation and increasingly subjects of record. Dogs made the jump first. In Britain and parts of Europe, people who bred hunting hounds and lapdogs started to write down pedigrees, publish manuals, and argue in print about the proper form of a spaniel's ear. The idea that an animal's lineage could be traced, standardized, improved, became a sort of pastime for the comfortable classes. Cats slid into this world almost sideways. For a long time they were considered too independent, too ordinary, to merit the same fuss. But in parlours and drawing rooms, particular cats stood out. A long-haired creature with a dramatic ruff, a sleek animal with a strikingly pointed face, a robust tabby who seemed almost dog-like in its attachment to one person. As railways tightened, national networks and newspapers carried curiosities from city to city. Stories of remarkable cats began to travel. A lady in one town wrote about her unusually fluffy animals from the East. A gentleman in another admired a neighbour's blue-grey Mauser and wondered aloud whether such a colour could be fixed in a line. The notion of the fancy took hold. A community of enthusiasts who took pleasure in talking, arguing, and eventually competing over particular traits. There had already been poultry fanciers, pigeon fanciers, rabbit fanciers. By the mid-19th century, the cat fancy emerged, first as scattered conversations, then as organised clubs. One of the most famous crystallising moments came in London, when the Crystal Palace, originally built for a great exhibition of industry and empire, hosted what is often regarded as the first modern cat show. Cats, which had spent millennia slipping through storerooms and alleyways, were invited into a glass palace to sit in cages while strangers judged them. Visitors wandered past rows of animals, each accompanied by a small card. Age, sex, sometimes a fanciful name, sometimes a claimed origin, Persian, Siamese, Manx. Judges awarded prizes. Newspapers reviewed the event with a mixture of amusement and earnest interest. It was both a spectacle and, in the minds of organisers, a beginning of something more systematic. From such shows, early breed standards grew. Enthusiasts looked at the motley crowd of domestic cats and decided which features counted. Long hair became the signature of Persians, even though long-haired cats probably had a scattered presence in Europe long before the name. Blue colouring and a compact shape were celebrated in what would become the British short hair. A cat from Southeast Asia with pale fur and dark points on ears, face, paws, and tail was presented as Siamese, its exotic backstory polished and repeated. These standards were written down in simple lists at first: head shape, ear size, tail length, eye colour, coat pattern. A cat meeting the description could be registered. Its offspring, if bred with another registered cat, could be traced. Over time, these lists grew more elaborate, turning into detailed blueprints of the ideal exemplar of each breed. Selection followed the blueprint. People who cared about winning shows or producing fashionable animals began to choose mating pairs on purpose, not just for general health or hunting skill, but to emphasize particular looks. A slightly flatter face was bred to an even flatter one. A somewhat longer coat was matched with another. Kittens that edged closer to the written standard were kept for breeding. Others were sold as pets, or simply not recorded. Within a few generations, visible changes appeared. Some breeds developed rounder heads, more massive bodies, or dramatically shortened muzzles. Others acquired very large ears, or unusually slender frames, or coats that lacked a full layer of guard hairs and so felt almost like silk to the touch. Yet under the show benches and pedigrees, another continuity ran strong. The core behaviours that had knit cats to humans since the first granaries remained stubbornly similar. A prize-winning champion could still react to a fluttering scrap of paper with the same predatory focus as a barn cat confronting a mouse. A carefully documented pedigree did not erase the basic pattern of self-chosen affection, sudden playfulness, or quiet refusal to cooperate. Owners at these early shows discovered this in small, embarrassing ways. A cat expected to sit serenely for the judges might instead curl up and sleep, or turn its back, or decide it was time to wash. Another might slip its catch and vanish into the rafters, the very qualities that made cats endlessly watchable at home: independence, unpredictability, the sense that they were only half persuaded to share space with humans, refused to flatten into pure display. The new focus on breeds also brought new kinds of tension. Some of the traits that humans found charming or striking came with hidden costs. Very flat faces could be associated with breathing or eye problems. Extremely long fur, while beautiful under artificial light, could mat easily and require constant grooming to avoid discomfort. Breeding within narrow lines to preserve a particular colour or head shape increased the risk of inherited diseases. To many early fanciers, these issues were barely understood, if at all. Veterinary science itself was in a formative stage, but over time, and especially in the 20th century, critics began to point out the difference between traits that had emerged naturally around human settlements: strong bones, keen senses, a coat suited to local climate, and traits cultivated mainly for human taste, which might compromise agility, health, or the ability to live easily without constant intervention. The contrast can be imagined as two overlapping populations. One is the old, sprawling tribe of domestic cats, village cats, ship cats, alley cats, farm cats, their gene pool broad, their bodies shaped mostly by survival and by quiet, practical preferences of people who needed a competent hunter. The other is a set of branching labelled lines, each with a club, a description, a set of show rules, spending more time indoors, being chosen for their faces and colours as much as for their skills. Even so, the wall between these populations was never absolute. Many pedigree cats still caught mice when given the chance. Many unregistered cats carried a mix of traits from recognised breeds, and cats in general continued, as they always had, to ignore some of the categories built around them. A show catalogue might list long hair, blue, female, champion, but the cat herself did not know those words. She knew the scent of the judging hall, the feel of the crate, the unfamiliar voices. She knew perhaps the relief of returning to a quieter room, the familiar smell of a particular human, the remembered pattern of the home she stalked at night. The Victorian reinvention of the cat transformed how people talked about them, how they wrote about them, how they organised them on paper. It created registries and clubs and a language of breeds that would spread around the world. What it did not do was fully rewrite the animal at the centre of all this attention. Beneath the groomed fur and the careful pedigrees, the descendants of Near Eastern wildcats still carried their ancient toolkit: the hunter's focus, the flexible body, the tendency to form loose, conditional bonds rather than absolute obedience. They adapted to the show ring as they had adapted to the granary and the monastery and the ship's deck, on their own terms, as long as it suited them. As the 20th century unfolded and science learned to read genes directly, those terms would come into sharper focus, revealing just how much and how little humans had changed the cat. When scientists finally learned to read DNA with some precision, cats stepped into the lab much the way they had stepped into the Crystal Palace, as familiar presences suddenly asked to sit still and be examined. The story that emerged from their genes was both simple and strangely elusive. Instead of many separate domestications scattered across the world, the genetic trail points back, again and again, to a single wild ancestor, the Near Eastern wildcat, Felis libica. Not the big dramatic cats of Africa, not the forest wildcats of Europe, but a small, sandy, alert creature of the dry lands where the first granaries rose. Studies that compare DNA from modern domestic cats, Near Eastern wildcats, European wildcats, and other regional cousins find that our house cats cluster tightly with that Near Eastern branch. It is as if all the cats sitting in windowsills from London to Tokyo are distant cousins of the hunters that once slipped like shadows along the edges of early fields in the Fertile Crescent. From that starting point, the spread looks almost like ripples. The earliest genetic split marks a move from the Near East into the Eastern Mediterranean, tracking with human movements into Anatolia and the Levant. Later, distinct signatures appear that match the Nile Valley, the coast of the Mediterranean, the trade routes into Europe and Asia. Each time humans opened a new corridor, by river, by cart, by ship, cats moved with them, leaving faint but traceable marks in their genomes. Yet compared to many domestic animals, the differences are subtle. If you look at the DNA of dogs, you see heavy human fingerprints, genes for tameness, for coat patterns, for size and skull shape, show signs of intense selection. Wolves and dogs have diverged so far that, even when they still can interbreed, they are obviously separate worlds. With cats, the divide is thinner. When researchers search cat genomes for the classic signature of domestication, regions where one variant has swept through a population because it offers a clear advantage in human environments, they do find them. But there are fewer, and they mostly live in places you might not expect. Some of the strongest changes are not in genes for colour or body shape, but in those that affect the brain and the senses. Regions linked to memory, fear response, and the ability to process rewards show hints of selection. The picture that emerges is of an animal that did not need to be remade from the ground up, but only nudged. A wild predator already comfortable around the edges of human spaces, becoming just tolerant enough, just curious enough, to linger in the light of our fires. Other differences cluster around coat and patterning. The familiar blotched tabby, the swirls and bullseye shapes you see on many house cats, appears to be a relatively recent arrival, spreading widely only in the last few centuries. Earlier cats, judging from both art and DNA hints, mostly wore the classic striped mackerel tabby of their wild ancestors. But even here, the transformation is modest. A wild cat and a domestic tabby standing side by side in the half-light could easily be mistaken for each other. The lightness of this domestication footprint has another cause, one that makes cats behave oddly in genetic studies. They have never been fully fenced off from their wild relatives. In many regions, domestic cats and wild cats still share territories, cross paths, and sometimes mate. The offspring may look almost entirely like one or the other. To human eyes, they merge back into the local population. To geneticists, they create a blurred edge between wild and domestic that is difficult to draw as a sharp line. Europe is a good example. The European wildcat, Felis sylvestris sylvestris, is not the ancestor of the house cat. Yet in places where its dwindling populations overlap with free-roaming farm cats, DNA studies have found mixtures. Wild cats carrying domestic alleles, village cats carrying distinctly wild signatures. Conservationists worry about this genetic dilution. But from the cat's point of view, it is simply the continuation of an old habit, choosing mates according to proximity and opportunity, not according to human categories. In the Eastern Mediterranean, similar patterns appear between Near Eastern wildcats and domestic populations. In island settings or isolated valleys where wildcats vanished long ago, domestic cats may form nearly closed gene pools. In other places, the boundary is porous. A feral cat slips into the hills, a wild cat prowls the outskirts of a village. Their descendants may end up on someone's roof or in someone's barn, their ancestry written only in a few scattered stretches of DNA. This ongoing gene flow quietly undermines any story that treats pure domestic cats as a distinct, sealed-off creation. The pedigrees invented in the 19th century rest on genuine genealogical records, but they cover only a thin recent layer of the cat's genetic history. Underneath the named breeds lies a broad shared reservoir that has been swirling and mixing since the first wildcats walked into early villages. Lines humans call pure are usually narrow slices taken from that reservoir and shaped for a handful of traits, not separate origins. Modern genetic research has refined the old stories without entirely replacing them. It has confirmed that cat domestication began in the Near East, not independently in many scattered places, although other regions later added their own wild blood. It has supported the idea that Cyprus and Egypt were early hubs from which particular lineages spread. It has shown how strongly Mediterranean and later European cat populations bear the imprint of animals moved along trade routes, on ships, with armies and merchants and migrants. At the same time, it has left large areas in shadow. The exact timing of the first taming steps is still debated. Some estimates place the initial divergence between wild and domestic lines around 9,000 to 10,000 years ago, aligning with early agriculture. Others suggest a more drawn-out process, with centuries or millennia of loose association before anything like a distinct domestic gene pool appeared. The details of how many early lineages were involved and how often they braided back together remain partly hidden. Ancient DNA from cat bones is harder to recover than from some larger animals, and the archaeological record is patchy. New finds, burials, mummies, skeletons from shipwrecks and port cities continue to add small corrections, like a dim map slowly gaining contour. One thing, however, becomes clearer the more closely the genes are read. Humans never exerted on cats the kind of sustained directional pressure that shaped animals like dogs, cattle, or horses. We didn't demand that they pull or guard or herd or carry us. We needed them mostly to remain what they already were, efficient, self-motivated hunters willing to operate in our vicinity. Selection favoured cats that tolerated humans, that could handle the noise and smells of granaries, temples, workshops and alleyways, that could rest in our houses and still explode into motion at the faint rustle of a mouse. It didn't favour unconditional obedience or dependence on constant instruction. That history is written in their DNA as much as in their stories, a modest reshaping of temperament and appearance laid over a resilient wild core, preserved by ongoing exchanges with wild cousins and by the cat's own habit of choosing mates and territories with limited reference to human plans. As the genetic picture comes into focus, one last question grows sharper rather than fading away. If humans and cats have lived together for so long, and if we've been able to mould the genomes of other animals so deeply, why did cats remain only lightly domesticated? Why did they keep that semi-independent stance, that ability to live with us, and also, at any time, to step away? To answer that, we have to step back from molecules and markers and look again at behaviour, at mutual needs, and at the kind of relationship both sides were willing to accept. To see why cats never quite followed the dog's path, it helps to put the two stories side by side and watch how they begin. Wolves did not simply drift into human camps. The most common picture, supported by genetic and archaeological hints, is of a long, awkward corridor of cooperation. Some wolves, slightly less fearful, began trailing human hunting groups, feeding on carcasses and scraps. Over time, the tamest, most biddable animals did best around people. Humans, for their part, noticed that these wolves could be alarm systems, partners in hunts, guards against rival groups. A feedback loop formed. People tolerated and fed the calmer wolves. Those wolves that could read human signals, respond to gestures, and accept discipline were more likely to survive and breed near camps. Little by little, selection favoured animals that were not just unafraid of humans, but actively oriented toward them. The result, many generations later, was a creature whose primary social world could be human-shaped: the dog. Cats started from a different place, with different needs. Their wild ancestor was a solitary ambush predator of small prey. A Near Eastern wildcat did not need a pack to bring down a gazelle. It needed patience, excellent hearing, and the ability to stalk and spring in tight spaces. Its survival depended on a territory rich enough in mice and birds, and on avoiding larger predators and rivals. When early farming villages arose, they quietly solved most of that equation. Granaries and waste piles brought rodents. Walls and human presence deterred some larger threats. For a wildcat, slipping into that human-created niche required only a modest behavioural adjustment, a slightly higher tolerance for noise, for smoke, for the scent of people. The cat did not have to look to humans for food. It could harvest the rodents on its own. So the domestication pathways diverged in structure. Dogs moved along a cooperative, almost contractual track. You help us hunt, guard, pull, herd, we feed and shelter you. Deep trainability, attention to human cues, and a willingness to subordinate some of their own impulses became central traits. Cats moved along a commensal track. You pile up grain and garbage that feeds the mice. We will eat the mice. Tolerance, not obedience, was the key. A cat that was too fearful would avoid the village and lose access to steady prey. A cat that was too aggressive toward humans might be driven off or killed. But a cat did not need to read facial expressions, follow pointing fingers, or learn complex commands to thrive. It only needed to coexist. Their behavioural ecology reinforced this separation. A wolf's natural social unit is already cooperative. Pack hunting requires coordination, role differentiation, and sensitivity to signals from others. It is not such a great leap to extend that sensitivity to a new, large, oddly hairless pack member, the human. A wildcat is territorial and largely solitary. It can tolerate overlapping ranges and loose colonies where food is abundant, but its fundamental toolkit is built around independent hunting and cautious, optional social contact. Kittens play and cluster. Adults often prefer a careful spacing, punctuated by brief alliances and quiet truces. When such an animal moves into human space, it does not spontaneously become a partner waiting for instructions. It becomes a neighbour. Selection pressures in human environments amplified this. For dogs, the most useful individuals were those that could attend to us. Dogs that were good at reading eyes, understanding gestures, staying within the boundaries of a flock or a camp, and responding reliably to signals were valuable. People bred from those dogs deliberately, or simply favoured them in ways that shaped reproduction. For cats, the bar for useful was lower and more focused. A cat that killed rodents efficiently, did not panic at household commotion, and did not bite or scratch excessively when handled was good enough. There was little reason for early farmers to invest in shaping complex behaviour. Cats patrolled on their own schedule, slipped into granaries at night, and managed the pest problem with minimal supervision. In that world there was no strong pressure to create a creature that waited for human direction. A cat that ignored orders but caught more mice was still a success. Instruction, training, and close social bonding were optional extras, not central to the bargain. This is where the idea of self-domestication becomes especially useful. Cats, like some urban foxes and commensal rodents today, essentially domesticated themselves into our spaces. Humans created a new ecological niche. Cats that could exploit it, while dialing back their flight response, prospered. Over time, those individuals that were less reactive, more exploratory, and more capable of forming a shallow trust with humans did better around villages. Mutual tolerance, not deep reshaping, was the heart of the deal. We did not insist that cats abandon their hunting strategies or their flexible social lives. We did not ask them to synchronize their movements with ours, to look to us for cues about what to chase or where to sleep. We mostly asked them not to flee, not to attack us, and to keep killing the things that ate our grain. They in turn didn't require that we become their primary social group. A cat could bond with a person, or with a cluster of people, or with another cat, or with a territory. These bonds could be intense, but they were also revisable. If the household changed or the cat wandered off, it could in many cases rebuild its life elsewhere. This looseness left more of the wild cat intact. Where dogs gradually reshaped their minds around human companionship, many cats retained the ability to toggle between modes: house cat, barn cat, alley cat, feral hunter. The genetic changes that nudged them toward us mostly softened fear, adjusted reward systems, and allowed them to find comfort in proximity. They didn't completely rewrite the underlying program of solitary hunting and independent decision-making. And so, thousands of years into this shared story, we find ourselves in an unusual relationship. We live with an animal that is undeniably domestic, often affectionate, often deeply attached, sleeping on our beds and purring in our laps, but still carries within it an intact capacity to live without us. We gained a small predator that could patrol our margins, a presence that slipped quietly from field to storeroom to hearth. We gained companionship that does not always look to us for orders, that can sit beside us in the dark without asking for a task. The cats, for their part, gained shelter from storms, safe places to raise kittens, food when hunting failed, and a worldwide distribution far beyond the wild cat's original range. But they kept something essential: the right, at any moment, to step through the door, follow a fence line into the night, and let the old instincts lead. They never became dogs because the world we built for them never demanded it, and because their own nature never required it. The bond settled instead into a quieter shape. Two species sharing space and benefits, each still recognizably itself. If you follow that thread, from the first mice slipping into the first granaries to the cat stretched on your pillow tonight, the arc is surprisingly gentle. We did not seize a wild predator and chisel it into something new. We built stores of grain, made little islands of abundance, and a certain kind of wild cat stepped closer. From there, the story wandered. Through stone villages whose names we no longer know. Through Cyprus, where someone cared enough to bury a cat and a human together. Through Egypt, where the feline shape climbed from household helper to sacred emblem, painted on walls, cast in bronze, wrapped carefully for the next world. Then onward again, down river routes and coastal roads, tucked into the shadowy corners of trading ships, slipping through ports and caravan stops, latching onto new settlements wherever rats were bold and people were busy, in monasteries and townhouses, in barns and alleys, in witch stories and sailors' tales. Cats followed the human experiment without ever fully merging into it. In our time, we have turned the same curious gaze on them that ancient people once turned on the sky. We have read their bones, tracked their remains across temples and trash pits, and more recently, traced their ancestry through genes and genomes. We can see the signatures of their journey written there, the Near Eastern wildcat at the root, the gentle narrowing of diversity that marks life alongside us, the scattered hints of regional lineages shaped by trade, by isolation, by chance. We can say, with some confidence, that cats changed. Coats shifted, fear circuits softened, social tolerances expanded. We can see that there were not one, but at least two waves of spread, one tied to early farmers around the eastern Mediterranean, another carried by sailors and merchants in the classical and medieval worlds. We can even point to places in the DNA that seem to echo our preferences: friendliness, tractability, the way some cats seek out human touch. And yet, when you look at the whole picture, there is a kind of quietness to it. Compared to the sweeping transformation that turned wolves into dogs, the domestication of cats looks like a soft pencil sketch. Edges blurred, certain lines emphasized, but the underlying figure still recognizable. The wild cat is not buried deep in the past. It sits just under the fur in the way a house cat freezes at a rustle or melts into the shadows at an open door. That may be why they still feel, to many people, slightly unreal. You can share a bed with a cat for years and still have the sense that there is a private world in its head, a landscape of scents and moving shapes you will never quite enter. They know the sound of your footsteps, the specific rhythm of your breathing, the pattern of your day, but they also belong to something older, the hush of tall grass, the wait at a burrow's edge, the alert stillness when the wind shifts. We have surrounded them with our stories, guardians of temples, partners of witches, luck bringers and omens, hunters of plague rats, mascots on long voyages, cherished pets in small apartments. In each age we have asked them to stand for something: fertility, danger, independence, mystery. The cats themselves have simply continued to do what they have always done: watch, stalk, rest, explore, accept what comforts the human world offers, and keep a doorway open back to the wild. Modern science lets us put dates and sequences on pieces of that journey. It lets us say that certain coat colours spread with certain trade routes, that some populations diverged in steppe villages while others clung to coastal towns. It lets us compare the genetic footprints of feral colonies and pampered pedigrees, but it does not resolve the feeling that this is still an unfinished story. Right now, as you listen, there are cats curled on couches, patrolling barns, hunting along canal edges, living in city courtyards and on island cliffs. Some are woven tightly into human lives, every meal measured, every veterinary visit scheduled. Others live at the edge of our awareness, tolerated and occasionally fed, but fundamentally on their own. All of them are products of the same long negotiation that began when grain first piled up in clay bins. Where that negotiation goes next is not fixed. We are already shaping new chapters, indoor-only cats whose lives are bound almost entirely to human routines, managed colonies, conservation debates about feral populations and wild birds, genetic tests and designer breeds, efforts to understand feline cognition, emotion, and welfare with more care than any past century could manage. We have the power to make their world gentler, or narrower, or stranger, depending on the choices we make. For now, though, the house is quiet. A cat may be dozing somewhere nearby, or far away in another time zone, on another continent, another windowsill. The same small hunter, sharing our shelters, dreaming its own dreams. If you found yourself drifting a little with this story of granaries and goddesses, ships and genomes, and this half-wild companion who walked it with us, you can let that drowsiness deepen. And if you'd like more long, quiet journeys through history like this, you can gently tap like and subscribe so you'll find your way back here next time. Before you drift off completely, I'd love to hear from you in the comments. Where in the world are you listening from, and what time is it for you right now? A busy morning, a late night, a sleepless middle of the dark? Add your small note to this long shared record of humans and their animals. Then let the screen fade from your attention and leave the story where the cat prefers it. Open-ended, a door not quite closed, a path that can always slip back into the tall grass of the unknown.